Greetings, everyone. Greetings. And Linda, I want to thank you.
At a White House event today, Vice President Kamala Harris took the stage, now as the heir apparent for the Democratic cause. But Harris had a few words to say first about one person who wasn't there, President Biden.
Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
Harris was speaking to a group of college athletes. It was her first public appearance since Biden announced Sunday he was dropping out of the race and endorsing her to be the Democratic nominee in his place. Biden made that decision while being holed up in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware this weekend, recovering from COVID. Our White House bureau chief Tolu Olorunnipa is also in Delaware, where he's been reporting for days.
Before President Biden made his surprise announcement that he was dropping out of the race, the Democratic Party was largely demoralized. They were plagued by infighting. They were plagued by the various factions between the people who were calling for Biden to drop out of the race and the people that were saying he should stay in and fight. This was a sign of disunity that was really impacting the party at the time when they are really concerned about Donald Trump coming back into the presidency.
But Tolu says now that cloud of chaos hanging over the Democratic Party appears to have dissipated. All the attention is now turning to Kamala Harris. As a Black and Asian American woman, Harris would be a historic candidate. And at 59, she's decades younger than Biden and former President Donald Trump.
That has led to major surges of enthusiasm, Democrats being excited, the party falling in line. The party that was very disunified before Biden made this announcement seems pretty unified around the idea of appointing Kamala Harris as the next candidate and getting behind her in her effort to defeat Trump in November.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi. It's Monday, July 22nd. Today, Democrats' Plan B. We're talking with Tolu about Biden's decision to pass the torch. And later in the show, we're breaking down what you need to know about Harris's career and how she got to this moment. My co-host Martine Powers sat down with White House reporter Cleve Wootson, who's covered the vice president for years. But first, here's my chat with Tolu. In the past few weeks, there's been this slowly growing chorus of Democrats, and now reporting has emerged about, what some top Democratic leaders behind the scenes were even talking about and doing. But all the while, all the indications seem like Biden was adamant, and his campaign aides, they were all adamant that he was staying in the race. What do we know about what happened this weekend that caused him to, it seems like, change his mind?
Yeah, first, this was a big surprise when this announcement went out to a lot of the people in President Biden's orbit, in part because he had been so adamant about staying in, even after catching COVID, even after a slew of polls showed him trailing Trump. It was clear that he was determined to stay in the race. He was casting this as a fight between the elites and the grassroots of the party. And what happened over the weekend was he had a number of his close aides, people that have been with him for decades, come to his beach house in Rehoboth and have a bit of a come to Jesus moment where they showed him the polling. They talked to him about what it would mean for his legacy to lose to Donald Trump. And he made a decision late on Saturday evening and decided that he was going to put out a statement on Sunday. And he did not even tell a number of his top aides until a minute before that statement went out at 1:46 p.m. that this was his decision. It was a very abrupt moment in presidential politics.
Oh, like 1 minute before is how they all found out that their boss wasn't going to run for re-election.
Yes, that Sunday afternoon, there were some who were not on this call with President Biden. And so they found out via tweet, they found out via this post on social media that President Biden was saying that he was bowing out of the race, that he would remain on as president, but he was not going to continue his campaign for a second term.
One other question I had for you, Tolu. What is your reading of how Democrats, prominent Democrats, are responding to his decision, and what are they saying about Joe Biden, and what do you make of their statements right now?
Well, first, there's this huge sense of relief within the party. The party had spent more than 3 weeks gripped by infighting, by chaos, by a sense of uncertainty about what would happen, and a sense of fatalism about Donald Trump coming back into the White House after looking at a number of these polls. And so there was a huge sense of relief. We saw an excitement within the party. We saw a number of people saying that what Biden did was very selfless, that he had taken this step that a lot of people were not expecting him to take by taking himself out of the running. And they hailed him for his selflessness. They said that he was willing to put the party and the country before his own self-interest. And so we saw an outpouring of support and love for Joe Biden that we hadn't been seeing over the past several weeks as people were thinking about whether or not he should stay in or get out of the race. And at the same time, we saw a huge influx of support for Harris, who we have to remember has not always been the favorite of the party. There have been people who have said that she was a drag on the ticket, that she was not someone who brought a lot to the ticket in the Biden-Harris campaign. But now there seems to be a full-throated sense of support behind her, in part because there's not a lot of time for Democrats to come up with another person, but also in part because the party has been seeking and wanting to unify around something to energize them after these 3 weeks of demoralizing infighting. And so Harris has really emerged as that figure, not only because she's a history-making candidate, but because she, in her own right, is someone who people see as a good person to match up against Donald Trump. She's a former prosecutor. Donald Trump is a felon. She is someone who is more equipped to take Trump on and to attack him and to criticize him and make the case against him in the way that Biden couldn't. And so people are excited about that after worrying about whether or not Biden would be well-equipped enough to take the fight to Donald Trump over the next 3 months.
And just really quickly, is anyone saying if he's not equipped to take the fight to Donald Trump, he should step down as president right now?
Many Republicans are saying that. They're saying if Biden at 81 is too old and not mentally equipped to run for president, then he shouldn't be president. Several have called for him to resign immediately. That's not going to happen. It's sort of being interpreted as standard politicking. But that has been the response. And I think that's going to last for a while, but more we're going to hear people training their fire on Kamala Harris because she now is the person in the spotlight. There's going to be less focus on Biden even in these last 6 months of his presidency, and a much larger focus on his vice president, who for all intents and purposes is now the leader of the Democratic Party, and people are going to be focusing on her. Both supporters and detractors are going to be focusing on her like never before.
Yeah, let's dig a little bit more into what this, as you talked about and described, the enthusiasm and the coalescing around Kamala Harris, who we should say is not the Democratic nominee just because President Biden has endorsed her. But who are the other people? Can you tell me specifically who has come out to back her? How are leaders in the party responding? What do we know about how voters are responding? What has that looked like in the past 24 hours?
Well, one example would be this Zoom call that took place on Sunday night, just hours after this development took place, where this group called Win with Black Women held a Zoom call, and they thought they'd have a few thousand Black women joining. By the time everyone got on the call, there were more than 40,000 women who were amped up, enthusiastic about the idea of voting for the first Black woman to be president. And the call was so large that they had to reach out to an executive from Zoom to get some technical support because they wanted to be able to expand the call to as many people as wanted to join. And that is just one example of the kind of enthusiasm that we've seen. They've raised more than $50 million in the first 18 hours after Kamala Harris jumped into this race. That number is growing as we speak.
And I assume that number is comparatively very high. That's like a big number to raise quickly, huh?
That's larger than any single day of the Biden campaign thus far. It's a huge number.
Wow.
And it doesn't even include some of the high dollar donations that are going to be coming in. You have to remember that a number of high dollar donors decided to pull their support from Biden after the debate and sort of keep their powder dry. And as soon as Kamala Harris jumped into the race, a number of those donors said their checkbooks are back open, they are excited again, and they're ready to let those dollars start flowing again. And so there's grassroots support, there's support from the donor class, there's support from a number of the key interest groups that are calling for Democrats to be able to unite and keep Trump out of the office. And so there does seem to be this groundswell of support around Kamala Harris. Now, she's going to have to perform. She's going to have to show that she can do the job and show that she's worthy of all of the support that she's getting. But there was a sense when people were considering whether Biden should drop out that there could be chaos if he left the race and that people would start fighting over the nomination, that other candidates would jump in and there would be this free-for-all. That has not happened thus far. No other major candidate has raised their hand. And instead of raising their hand, a number of the other people that were expected to be considered as potential presidential candidates have instead endorsed Kamala Harris and said that they would not run. And so it does seem like this huge coming together of the party, galvanized by Kamala Harris's candidacy and ready to take on Trump in November.
So, Tolu, who are some of those people who others were thinking, oh, they could maybe challenge Kamala Harris, and they've backed her now? And I know the Washington Post were keeping track of all the, prominent lawmakers and other Democrats who have endorsed her. But also there are some names missing from that list. We're talking midday on Monday, and there are some big names who still have not endorsed Kamala Harris. Who are those people, and what do you make of that?
Yeah, there are a number of people who so far have not offered their endorsement. People like former President Barack Obama, one of the most popular people within the party, if not the most popular person within the party. He said the Democrats would eventually find the right candidate, but did not endorse Harris. Also, Majority Leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and the Minority Leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, have both supported Biden's decision to drop out, but have not come out in support of Harris yet. And so a lot of the party leaders are keeping their powder dry for now, but in terms of the people who would potentially come out and compete against Harris, we're talking about a number of the governors that are part of this upcoming generation of rising Democratic leaders, people like Wes Moore of Maryland, J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, Gavin Newsom of California, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. They have all said they would not be running for the race, and they endorse Kamala Harris. And she is on the cusp of getting the kinds of delicate support that she would need to have this thing fully in the bag. And once that happens, this is her race to lose at that point in terms of the Democratic nomination.
So, Tolu, what does happen next, just on the logistical side of things, and how does that interact with the Democratic National Convention, which is happening in just a few weeks in Chicago?
So there is a process and a set of rules that Democrats have to follow at this point. Now that Biden has dropped out of the race, the delegates are the ones that are going to determine who the Democratic nominee is. Those are key leaders of the party from all the states across the country. And Kamala Harris, or whoever the Democratic nominee will be, will need to get a majority of those delegates to support them over the coming days and weeks ahead of the nomination process happening in Chicago next month. And so we've already seen a number of delegates come out and support Kamala Harris. Whether or not she gets the majority, that remains to be seen, or how quickly she gets the majority, that remains to be seen. But she has been speaking and reaching out to key party officials who have a vote in this process. And when she is able to get a majority of delegates, Democrats are going to gather. They're either going to have a virtual nominating process in the days ahead, or they're going to wait for their convention in August to have an official nomination on the convention floor. And that is something that at this point, it looks like Kamala Harris is on track to secure, but it does remain an open process. It is a process of rules that the party has to follow. And so they're following those rules, even as it seems like Kamala Harris is well-positioned to be the next nominee.
Tolu, it is so early, and of course we have to caveat and say overtly she is not the official nominee, despite all of the groundswell of support and everything that you're telling us here. With that caveat, what do we know, if anything, about what Harris's priorities as president would be? Do you have any sense right now of what she's going to say on the campaign trail, of what her day one goals would be?
Well, she has been campaigning very fervently as part of the Biden-Harris ticket, and one of her top messages has been to attack Donald Trump, to make this race about Donald Trump, about all the things that he stands for, about the Project 2025, which is this far-right agenda of programs and policies that are backed by Trump allies that a number of Democrats are worried about. They feel like it's an extreme agenda, and Trump's allies are saying that they would put them into place as soon as he gets sworn into office. And so Kamala Harris and the Democrats are spending a lot of time talking about it. And so I would expect that to continue. She also needs to introduce herself to some of the country that, even though she's been vice president, is not familiar with her, not familiar with her record, not familiar with her background. And so I imagine that you'll see ads talking about her rise through the political ranks up to becoming the vice president, her time as a prosecutor, her time as Attorney General of California and as a senator from California, the executive experience she's had, the experience she's had dealing with foreign policy as vice president. And so she's going to talk about her qualifications for the job and her own personal backstory, while also spending a lot of time talking about Trump, talking about the fact that he is a convicted felon, talking about the fact that he has talked about wanting to do a number of extreme things and even embraced the idea of authoritarian impulses. And she is going to make that broad case that she is for democracy and that Trump is for autocracy. And that is a message that she's been practicing for a long time, but she's going to have a much larger spotlight on her as she moves forward. And also as she makes key decisions like who her vice presidential candidate will be if she's able to secure the nomination.
Tolu, thank you so much for making time to speak with us.
Thank you.
Tolu Olorunnipa is the White House bureau chief for The Post. Next, we're going to go deep on Vice President Harris. My co-host Martine Powers spoke with Cleve Wootson, a reporter who's covered Harris for years at The Post. Their conversation is really illuminating, digging up parts of Harris's history and how she's evolved as a politician over the years. Martine and Cleve will pick it up from there after the break.
So I think a lot of us have heard parts of Kamala Harris's origin story at one point or another. But can you just remind us a little bit of like where her story starts and how she kind of got to be a public figure?
Her story starts in Oakland. Her mother was a breast cancer researcher, but she was also an activist. And she's from India originally. Her father is Jamaican. She will often tell voters that she was the child of an activist. And she recounts being pushed around in the stroller to protest and demonstrations. She went to Howard, became an Alpha Kappa Alpha. I'm not going to skew-wee here, but it's a historically black sorority. Then she went back to California, where she was district attorney of San Francisco and the attorney general of California before getting elected to the U.S. Senate the same year that Donald Trump got elected president.
Well, let's pause for a moment here and unpack that time in her life of her being a prosecutor, first as a DA and then as the attorney general in California. How did that part of her career unfold?
Her people will tell you one of the through lines of her career was picking things that are just about fighting for the people, not just as a prosecutor, but also as attorney general, like issues of, David versus Goliath type stuff. At the end of her tenure, she emerged as sort of a tough on crime prosecutor.
I strongly believe, and the work of my office has proven it to be true, that when we're talking about serious and violent crime, lock them up.
Maybe at a time when it wasn't a good look to be a tough on crime prosecutor, but she prosecuted some marijuana convictions, for example. She cracked down on the parents of truant students for not getting their kids to school all of the time. Her conviction rate went up. So she did emerge as somebody who was tough on crime in an era where that matters to certain groups, but maybe where that isn't as beneficial to her or to Biden with certain aspects of the Democratic Party.
So after she's a prosecutor, she, as you said, goes on to become a senator. And it's not just that she's in the Senate, but she becomes a senator at this critical moment in American politics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, she's the junior senator from California at a time when the Democratic establishment writ large is sort of shocked by the ascension of Trump. She ultimately got onto the Judiciary Committee, where she frequently had the opportunity to interview Trump's appointees and Trump's cabinet.
Did you have any communications with Russian officials for any reason during the campaign that have not been disclosed in public or to this committee?
I don't recall it, but I have to tell you, I cannot testify to what was said as we were standing.
Jeff Sessions, Trump's attorney general, famously said, the senator is making me nervous when he was facing the spotlight of her question.
somebody
Sir,
came
I
up to me.
have just a few.
Well, you let me qualify it. If I don't qualify it, you'll accuse me of lying. So I need to be correct as best I can.
I do want you to be honest.
And I'm not able to be rushed this fast. It makes me nervous.
And there was another point where she really went after Brett Kavanaugh during his Supreme Court nomination hearing.
Can you think of any laws that give government the power to make decisions about the male body?
And these are questions that are going viral. They're going across Twitter, and she's largely channeling that sort of Democratic ire directed at Trump.
Yeah, in that moment, it really seems like she was considered like this person who was going to be holding Trump appointees to account by asking them the hard questions and pointing out their, alleged wrongdoings.
Yeah, and not being nice to them. It was a period where I think many minorities, women and minorities, at least on the Democratic side, felt marginalized, felt unseen, right? And then you have this minority woman who is one of few minority women to ever be in the Senate at all, just giving it to Trump's officials. And it really caused her star to rise.
And so with that context, it's not surprising that she was going to run for president in 2020. Can you talk a little bit about how that went for her?
So after this sort of star turn in the Senate, she decides to run for president. And her opening, her announcement, her kickoff was probably one of the best that year of any of the candidates. She drew 20,000 people to Oakland City Hall.
Let's do it together, and let's start now. And I thank you, and God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
She just spat fire in this speech. The donations poured in. That first week, she was extremely ascendant. But what happened as time went on was a lot of voters that I talked to said, well, she was really had a difficult time articulating a vision for the country. She was really good at asking those questions of Trump officials, but answering questions about her vision for the country or how she's going to provide health care for everybody across the country really became very difficult for her.
My Medicare for All plan is about saying, let's make sure that cost is not a barrier to people's access to health care. Let's make sure that people have the option to have a private plan if that's what they want. I've traveled the country.
And it caused other folks, other voters who were very focused on beating Trump, finding the best person to beat Trump, to kind of migrate over to other candidates. And so by December, her campaign asphyxiated. She was out of cash and she was out of the race before a single ballot was cast.
Yeah, before any of the primaries, before the Iowa caucuses, that she was the first one out.
Nearly 2 months before anybody caucused, the person who was seen as perhaps one of the most ascendant candidates in the primary is gone.
So when we look at that campaign and how it ultimately didn't work out, why do people think that Harris is the obvious alternative to Biden now?
One of the reasons that so many folks that I've talked to have said that people are rallying around Kamala Harris is that even though her first campaign for president was ill-fated, it did not last a year, she faced that constant spotlight from, the American public, the oppo, from the opposition research from Republicans, the scrutiny from members of the media like me, other opponents going at her. And so now in 2024, they're saying, she's really the only person on this short list of fantasy team Democrats that has been vetted in a national spotlight. It did not go well for her. She ran out of money. She couldn't articulate a vision. But all of these other candidates that are in people's, heads about can run haven't really faced that level of vetting, that level of scrutiny that she has. She has been through the fire and they have not. We know how she is under fire.
That's very interesting. So now I want to talk about Harris being chosen as Joe Biden's running mate. I think in that moment, there was a sense that Harris, as a woman of color, could really help Biden court voters that he really needed, not only people of color, but also younger people. And at the same time, this choice was being made in a complicated moment, right? That was the summer of 2020, the summer of George Floyd. And Harris's background as a prosecutor was not something that I think resonated with a lot of people who in that moment are, thinking a lot about history of criminal injustice in the U.S. And I think some of those questions and that wariness around Harris obviously followed her into her time as vice president. Talk a little bit about what has been uneven about her time as vice president and this narrative that I feel like I started hearing maybe like 6 to 9 months after the inauguration of like, oh, Harris isn't doing a good job, or she's not a good vice president, or like this isn't really working out for her. Like, tell me a little bit about what was happening that started to shape that narrative.
Yeah, I always chuckle a little bit at the Harris wasn't doing a good job of being vice president, because what is the job of vice president, right? The vice president has one kind of morbid job, right? But that said, she became vice president under COVID. And so the main thing that you do as vice president, which is flying across the country, shaking people's hands, kissing babies, touting the administration's policy, really was kind of taken away from her. When I talk to Democrats and when I talk to her people, some of Harris's issues with communication followed her into the vice president's office, especially because she was given some tough jobs. She was charged with addressing migration from the Northern Triangle countries where a lot of migrants were coming from. And Republicans honed in on that. So you have this job that's under the microscope. And I remember one particular interview where she was sort of like backed into saying, well, yes, I'll go to the border.
We've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border.
And folks just seized on that. And at the end of that year, she had a raft of staff's departures. Her chief of staff, her chief spokesperson, her communications director, all the people that are in charge of really crafting the vice president's image were sort of gone at this point where she's floundering at the end of her first year. The hard thing about covering Kamala Harris and about understanding Kamala Harris in this moment and in that moment is that she is a Black woman in a country that has issues with race, right? That has issues with misogyny. And so it can be very, very difficult to suss out what is a racial dog whistle or misogyny. Folks saying she can't do this because she's a woman versus just being good at your job.
And to be clear, when you're talking about these racial or gender dog whistles that are being aimed at Vice President Harris, what are you talking about?
Well, dog whistles, just by the nature of being dog whistles, can be very nebulous. But look at how some Republicans pronounce her first name. It's Kamala, right? And it's been pronounced, I'm not going to, repeat the mispronunciations, but there's a whole bunch of incorrect mispronunciations from people like Donald Trump or from Ron DeSantis that sort of serve to otherize her. She has this exotic, weird-sounding name. I think
like they can't even figure out how to say.
I can't even figure out how to say this. How to say this syllable name that begins with the word comma. That. There's also sort of this conception of woke tokenism, right? That she's not intelligent enough or fully up to the job because, she's just put there because she is a Black woman who can get the votes of other Black women. And then they'll intersperse that with other maybe legitimate criticisms, but that's sort of, adding the tinge of race or misogyny into it to sort of intensify the argument. Mm-hmm. The other thing that followed Harris into the White House was just the weight of history. She's the first Black and Asian woman to ever do it. And so a lot of people in those communities expected her to be making history all the time in a job as vice president where largely you are a background singer, right? You're touting the administration's policies and helping where you can, but you are not the star. And so what you see for that first year is Kamala Harris and her aides and the people around her sort of struggling with, how much history to make, how to communicate, how to both be sort of a history-making politician, but also a team player.
But not steal the limelight from
not
Biden.
Making too much history, right?
Mm-hmm. I think what you're describing here really frankly resonates with me in terms of like my struggling to understand like how much of the criticism of Harris was based off of legitimate concerns about, you know, the effectiveness of her as vice president versus the race stuff and the woman stuff in the sense that like a white man vice president could be saying and doing the same things and would not be getting the same flack for their performance that she is. And as you describe, it is really complicated. But I do want to dive more into immigration because it was such a big part of her kind of portfolio early on. And I think was something that a lot of people basically think that she failed at.
There was one close Kamala Harris ally that I talked to very often who said that her portfolio was trash. It was just a very, very difficult portfolio. Now, if you're vice president, you shouldn't be dealing with the easy stuff, right? The stuff that gets to your desk is going to be the hard stuff. Immigration's probably a really good issue there because they charged her with sort of getting at the root causes of what's causing people to come to the United States, to migrate to the United States. If we fix things in your home country, you won't feel the urge to uproot everything and come to the United States, which makes sense, but nobody saw it that way. Everybody, perhaps for political purposes or just for a lack of messaging, saw it as just like you said it. You know, Kamala Harris is addressing immigration, right? Republicans called her Biden's border czar. Even Democrats, even Jen Psaki in the White House briefing room had a difficult time sort of saying, well, Kamala Harris is covering this aspect of immigration.
The president asked the vice president to oversee our diplomatic efforts to address the root causes of migration from El Salvador to Guatemala and Honduras.
But don't blame her for this aspect of immigration.
In April, there were 22,000 kids in HHS facilities, and now that number is 14,000. Is there still more work to do? Absolutely. That's the purview of Secretary Mayorkas, but it's important every component of our government is coordinated.
And that just gets really, really hard. And what comes out of that muck really is Kamala Harris's name associated with immigration at a time when the number of people being stopped at the border is ballooning. Her first trip as vice president, and my first trip to Guatemala was when she went to Guatemala and then to Mexico to address some of these root causes of immigration. And she ended up...
And this was in June of 2021.
Yeah, this was in June of 2021. It's during the pandemic, but they're still making this trip because that's how important it was. And in her first kind of major moment, I guess.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
Republicans were never going to be assuaged by Democrats or by Biden on immigration, but that one also angered some folks on the left who said, you said you would have a kinder, gentler, more humane treatment of migrants, and here you are, in sort of the boldest terms, just saying don't come without sort of anything else that actually is of help to these people.
Okay, so then moving away from immigration, there were other issues that Harris took on and potentially to more success. Can you talk a little bit about some of the other parts of her portfolio and how she performed?
So I think the thing she's had the most success on has been sort of channeling the Democratic outrage at the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade. Kamala Harris has been a fairly big supporter of abortion rights and abortion access for her entire career. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, who's a lifelong Catholic, has really sort of struggled with his own personal faith and his own personal feelings about it, about an issue that really is at the core of the Democratic platform. Groups have called him to be more bold, to say the A word, to
famously he sort of alludes to the right to abortion as something that he thinks is meaningful and important, but doesn't really, as you said, say the word abortion or talk in specifics about what it means to have the right.
And what he found in Harris was somebody that is just not afraid or hesitant to sort of shout to the rafters about the importance of having access to this right, about the freedom associated with it. And so when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, Kamala Harris was at the forefront of the administration's efforts to talk about not just what this means for women across the country, but what this means for everybody.
How dare they? How dare they attack our healthcare system? How dare they attack our fundamental rights? How dare they attack the freedom of the women of America to make decisions about their own bodies?
And, whether other additional freedoms might be taken away, like IVF, for example. She also turned it into this sort of tidy argument against Trump and other Republicans. And she's also gone to red states or states that are enacting abortion bans to sort of raise this issue and sort of take this fight to places that are not just in the normal blue places. But what I will say is that most of the people that I've talked to consistently about Kamala Harris will say, she is better as a politician, as a vice president, as a candidate than she was, 3 years ago or 5 years ago. But a lot of what happened as she improved and got better was people just stopped paying attention. People were paying super close attention in her first year when they expected her to make history every time she woke up. And then she just, life kind of went on. They had jobs and kids to take care of and all of that stuff. And so as she has improved as a candidate or a vice president, a lot of folks haven't really been taking notice. And now we have sort of the refocusing of the spotlight on Kamala Harris again. She's met with Ukrainian President Zelensky half a dozen times. She's, done all of these foreign trips. She's kind of really solidified and cemented the stump speech around abortion and around Donald Trump. And so as people are being sort of reintroduced to Kamala Harris, as it were, I think they're seeing a stronger, somewhat more viable candidate. And they also sort of see a stronger, more viable candidate that they really sort of need at this moment.
Cleve, thank you so much for having this conversation. I found this so interesting.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Cleve Wootson is a White House reporter for The Post. He spoke with my co-host, Martine Powers. Before we go, I want to tell you about some other headlines that caught my attention today. Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle testified before the House Oversight Committee on Monday. This is following the assassination attempt on Trump.
On July 13th, we failed. As a director of the United States Secret Service, I take full responsibility for any security lapse of our agency. We are fully cooperating with ongoing investigations. We must learn what happened, and I will move heaven and earth to ensure that an incident like July 13th does not happen again.
Republican and Democratic lawmakers grilled Cheadle about the security at the rally where the shooting took place, and she frustrated them when she declined to answer some questions. She would not say how many agents were assigned to Trump that day, only noting that the number was, quote, sufficient. But Cheadle also resisted calls for her to step down, saying, quote, I think I am the best person to lead the Secret Service at this time. And another story, Delta Airlines canceled more than 600 flights today, continuing the fallout from last week's global tech outage. The technical issues stem from an update by the security firm CrowdStrike, and it affected Microsoft Windows users worldwide. CrowdStrike has apologized and blamed an error rather than a hacking attack for this meltdown. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you're looking for the latest updates on big political news, and there are a lot of updates, check out our other show, The Campaign Moment. They'll have analysis and insight into every twist and turn of the election, and you can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Emma Talkoff with production assistance from Trinity Webster Bass. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Rena Flores with help from Ariel Plotnick. Thanks to Naftali Ben-David and Nick Bauman. I'm Elahe Izadi. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.